This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I have moved away from my natural habitat in front of a computer screen to come to the residence of Dr. Bibek Debroy, who's the chair of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Bibek Da to many of us. I requested him for a conversation because this is a really opportune moment to discuss what's happening with the Indian economy. There's going to be a new government in India very soon, in the next few weeks, and Dr. Debroy is the perfect person to try and help us understand what's happening with the Indian economy at this point in time. Bibek, thanks very much for your time. I want to begin by asking you, a lot of people today talk about India becoming the third largest economy in the world by 2027. Could you begin by taking us through your opinion on how that might happen and the two or three main pillars that will propel us there? We're about fifth largest at the moment. How will we go to the third largest?
Well, I think the first thing I should say is that when one is making international comparisons, one uses a common numerator to compare across countries, and that happens to be the US dollar. When I'm converting our GDP, gross domestic product, so to speak, which happens to be in rupees, to US dollars, there are two ways of doing it. One is using the official exchange rates, and the other one is using PPP, purchasing power parity. In purchasing power parity terms, we are already beyond that. So we are not talking about PPP, we are talking about official exchange rates. When you say third largest, that's a relative comparison. And it's a dollar figure. It depends on the exchange rate. It depends on the real growth. And it also depends a little bit on inflation. The consensus across various people, not only within government but outside government also, is that India in the immediate short term is on a trajectory of somewhere between 6.5 to 7.5 real growth. If you ask people in government, they would say 7 to 7.5. If you ask people outside government, they would probably say 6.5 to 7. So let's take 7. If it is 7%, if you have reasonable expectations about inflation, if you do not expect the exchange rate to behave in a very perverse kind of way, it is almost certain, given what is happening in the countries that are now number 3 and number 4, that if not in 2027, in 2028, we will be the third largest because we are growing at about 7%.
Let's talk a little bit about, you correctly mentioned that this is the comparative analysis. Finally, we are going to be third largest, or we are fifth largest today in comparison to somebody or some others. Now, one of those countries is Japan, and recent reports suggest that in Japan there is a lot of trepidation now that a country like India, often thought of as part of the developing world, so to speak, is now propelling beyond Japan. First it was China, now it's India. What is actually happening in India which is helping propel this growth forward? A few things, of course, are the infrastructure we are building, the entrepreneurial drive that's coming, the money that's coming in as investment. But in your opinion, compared to countries like, say, Japan and Germany, countries that we are superseding to come to our third largest position, what are the main triggers for this growth in India?
Well, there are several triggers, but fundamentally, India has been continuously reforming. Reforms that were accentuated since May 2014, and there is a long list of such reforms. Fundamentally, India is becoming more productive. I can slice it whichever way I want, and what's happening to India is an aggregate of what's happening to states. So yes, there is infrastructure, yes, there is the digitization, yes, there are exports, yes, there is the government capital expenditure. All of these are feeding into the system. Had the external world been much more kind, then we would have grown at 8.5. Because the external world is not that kind, we are probably going to grow at 7 to 7.5. So this is inevitable. I cannot speak on behalf of the other countries, but this is an inevitable phenomenon of catching up, where The more advanced countries, so to speak, tend to stagnate. I should also mention the better fiscal management at the time of COVID and post COVID. Because unlike some of the countries in the rest of the world, which embarked on fiscal profligacy, the government of India consciously was very reluctant to widen the fiscal tap. Whatever was done in the form of capital expenditure, not revenue expenditure, and we can see the benefits of that.
One of the things critics point out at this juncture of any conversation about the Indian economy is, well, that's very well. The Indian economy is growing. It'll become, it's nearly 4 trillion now. It's going to exponentially grow. But what about per capita income? Now we know from government releases, so to speak, that in the last decade, roughly per capita income in India has doubled. But we still, at least critics would say, we are still a long way to go from becoming a upper middle income country as far as per capita income is concerned. Where do you see that go? And I'll have a question after this also about agrarian per capita income. But overall per capita income, where do you see that evolve from this point onwards as we go along?
Well, there are two ways to look at it. One way to look at it is in pure absolute terms. India's per capita income, especially if I'm talking about US dollars, is still low. And mind you, there's a great deal of heterogeneity within the country. The other way to look at it is compared to what it was, there has been a phenomenal improvement. And growth has an exponential angle to it. If I extrapolate and extrapolate conservatively, not very ambitious aspirational rates of growth, but reasonable rates of growth by 2047, which is a natural peg because a lot of projections are based on 2047 when India celebrates 100 years of independence. The per capita income will be at least 10,000 US dollars. So this means that India by conservative estimates will move to the upper middle income category. That's almost a given because it requires very conservative real rates of growth, conservative compared to what we might be able to achieve. A developed country status will require something in excess of 13,000. So we won't get to 13,000, I think, in 2047. There is a slight catch which I need to mention purely for pedantic reasons. One kind of computation is on the basis of constant dollars, which is what we are talking about. The other one is on current dollars. Current dollars, because of inflation, assuming that the World Bank does not change its classification, we will get to $13,000 also.
Let's talk about agrarian per capita income there, because a lot of the concern has been about whether the agrarian sector of the Indian economy is growing fast enough, whether per capita incomes are growing there fast enough. There's been a lot of talk about doubling farmer incomes. How do you see, or what do you see happening there? There's a lot of change happening there too. Farm level processing has exponentially grown. There's farm level entrepreneurship happening, all kinds of things. But there still seem to be some fundamental reforms still lacking.
Most of the reforms in agriculture, they are state subjects. We have the constitution, we have the seventh schedule, which clearly differentiates between the UN list, the union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. And most agricultural reforms are in the state list. I said earlier that Indian states are extremely heterogeneous. This is also the case with agriculture. I do not think one should talk about agriculture's contribution to GDP or agriculture's contribution to employment because it can be very misleading. The fact of the matter is, when we say that, let's say, 400 million people earn a living from agriculture, we are misstating the issue. We are misstating the issue because even in rural India, there is a considerable amount of employment that happens outside agriculture. Within agriculture, there is a considerable amount of value addition and addition to GDP that happens through commercialization and diversification as opposed to traditional crop output, and within that, cereal output. So agriculture is in a process of transition. It is true that many of the agricultural reforms are pending, Several of them relate to marketing, distribution, restrictions, controls on marketing and distribution. It is also true that we have not yet completely developed efficient land markets. Now, this is true, but these are not constraints, in my view, in the way of 7 to 7.5%. Some things become binding constraints if you're talking about a 9% growth. Obviously, because it's a state subject, because states are heterogeneous, because there are irrigated areas, there are multi crop areas, there are single crop areas, there are relatively dry land areas, there are large land holdings, there are small land holdings. It is difficult to generalize for Indian agriculture as a whole.
That brings me, the heterogeneity point that you mentioned a couple of times brings me to one of the things you recently wrote a few months ago, if I'm not mistaken, about the importance of internal trade. That people talk a lot about external trade, but internal trade is increasingly important in India. It's also important because the way Indian states are growing, several states now are actually at a, I mean, there's a lot of heterogeneity between the growth and the economic position of different states. Many states are as prosperous as many developed countries, and some other states are not, and roughly, therefore, India falls at a particular level. But there are states which are highly industrialized, and their growth pace is at a much higher, ticker, so to speak. So when we talk about, is it therefore wrong in a sense to talk about, investments that will come to India in a generic sort of way? We should be talking about investments that will come to India in specific regions. Also, how important is this internal trade part? Do you see this kind of internal trade really boost or add a new dimension to our growth in the future?
Often, India has been criticized that there isn't enough trade happening in India. That criticism is sometimes unfair because in any large country, there is a lot of internal trade that happens. It happens in Europe. Internal trade is facilitated, amongst other things, by the building of transport networks, particularly roads. It is also facilitated by the easing of interstate restrictions, GST being a case in point. So, yes, indeed, internal trade in India has been increasing and is likely to increase even more, and this is as it should be. So far as India's states are concerned, different states have different competitive advantages. They are not at similar levels of development. You use the word industry, I will interpret it as manufacturing because there is non manufacturing industry also. Traditionally, the manufacturing states have been Gujarat, Maharashtra. Increasingly, some of the southern states, with the exception of Kerala, have been picking up. When we make comparisons with developed countries, again we come back to this issue of purchasing power parity. It is indeed the case that is in purchasing power parity terms, some states in India are better off than in many parts of Europe. It is also true that even if I look at human development indicators, some states in India are better off than many parts of Europe. Having said that, one of the interesting things that has happened in India is some of the historically backward regions have begun to catch up. And some of the more advanced ones, I'm obviously thinking of Punjab as an example, are states where growth has started to peter out. One way to understand this complexity is to understand that if I think of a map of India in front of me, what is now happening is increasingly the north, the south, and the west, the center, all of that is getting integrated into the mainstream. And that is leading to entrepreneurship, it's leading to trade, it is contributing to growth. The worrying bit is what is happening in the eastern parts. Eastern parts, a place like UP, it's very difficult to generalize because it's a very heterogeneous state. But towards the east, Orissa is a state that has gone through remarkable transformations. But yes, by and large, the story is of many of the backward states now catching up.
Let's talk a little bit about these backward states catching up. I'll give you one example and I want you to comment on it. A few years ago, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, DPIIT started releasing data on FDI that goes through this at district level. Till then, we knew about FDI and how FDI flows were happening, of course, across sectors and then across states. Now we've begun to get data at a district level also. Now, when you map that data, the district level data, to aspirational districts, or some of the districts that really require help in India, often it is seen that, you know, not insignificant amounts of FDI, should I say, is going even to aspirational districts. What really is happening there, according to you? Is it exactly what you explained?
I can understand the utility of this,
Yes.
but I am also very skeptical
Okay.
because most of the time when we map FDI or domestic investments, we match them against the corporate headquarters.
Right.
Even though the manufacturing or whatever other economic activity happens somewhere completely different. There are different types of FDI, there are different causes for FDI. One part is to cater to the consumption market. If I'm going to cater to the consumer market, I need to be close to the consumer market, or I need to be in a place where it is easy for me to access those consumer markets through transport infrastructure or whatever else. The alternative reason why I want investments is because I want to source my production. Now, that depends on various things. It depends on costs, it depends on the availability of labor, it depends on the skills. It is true that in many traditional centers, real estate costs have become exorbitant. So, unless I have, depends on which sector we are talking about. Power would be completely different. Unless it is the case that I need to be closer to a consumption market, if I don't have a problem with skills, I can understand why it makes sense to relocate production away from urban centers, traditional urban centers, and metro. So, therefore, I quite understand this happening. Depends, of course, also on the sector.
Let's talk a little bit about supply chains. You mentioned the pandemic right in the beginning of our conversation. There's been a lot of conversation about supply chain resilience and whether through friend shoring, whether through other ways, India could benefit from this transition towards a supply chain resilience kind of thinking. Do you see that happening? Because some people still talk about, and correctly, in my opinion, countries like Vietnam still having, in a sense, an upper hand compared to India, even though India, of course, is continuously catching up. What do you think is happening there?
Um, I would state it a little bit differently.
Okay.
The issue is how important has manufacturing been in India? What can we do to push up manufacturing? And this has been debated for years and years. Manufacturing has never really picked up. There's been a long list of constraints. It is not desirable to be exclusively dependent on any single country for your imports. You need to diversify. India was already conscious of the fact that for some items, India was exclusively dependent on a single country for some imports. So the attempt to move away and diversify and the attempt to manufacture in India, it sort of preceded COVID. COVID accentuated the process. At the same time, there was the PLI scheme. It is a bit too early to gauge the success of the PLI scheme across the board because across sectors the PLI scheme did not take off at the same time. But in some sectors, it is patently clear that India is now becoming part of the global manufacturing supply chain. A prime example of that being mobile phones. Earlier, most mobile phones that were exported from India used to be basic phones. Today, the bulk of them are smartphones. So, I would say that unless one is behaving like an ostrich with the neck stuck in the sand, one needs to recognize that for the first time, there are signs that India is becoming part of the supply chain. Now, when one is making comparisons, investments look for different places, different uh, different countries as destinations. It is not always the case that an investment that already exists in some other country will relocate to India, as opposed to fresh investments happening in India. And also, to reiterate a point that I made earlier, investments don't happen in India, investments happen in states, which means availability of land, various clearances, procedures, etc., so on and so forth.
I have two last questions, Vivek, that on two sections of the economy, which have, a lot of people are beginning to talk a lot about. There has been considerable change in, women development in our country. We yet don't do the kind of studies comparing women development with FDI that's done in the West, but it's perhaps beginning. But we know from NSSO data, for instance, that on every parameter, whether it's women getting better, care from state resources before or after childbirth, whether it's amount of money they're making, whether they have access to a mobile phone which they alone use, to a bank account, each of these factors are seeing very significant betterment. We also know that more women are beginning to vote than ever before. In fact, this has been a part of the conversation for the last few years. I want you to join the dots for us because it's an old UN saying, for instance, that if a country really has to grow, it's women have to grow. You educate women, give them better health, and that's one of the great forces for growth. What's happening in this entire gender space in India? Connect the dots for us.
The dots are very simple. Are there gender biases in India? Of course there are. But that's almost like a tautological statement. The question to ask is, are those gender biases declining over time? And I think that anyone who looks at the data would unambiguously deduce that those gender biases are declining over time, be it in terms of educational indicators, be it in terms of health indicators. Some of this is because of the Narendra Modi government's interventions, some of which were particularly targeted towards women. There are also states which have initiatives targeted specifically towards women. So, this is one part of it. The other part of it, and some interventions, you see, they actually benefit women. For example, something like LPG cylinders as opposed to fetching firewood. Fetching firewood affects women much more than it does affect men. There is
Also, tap water, for instance.
also tap water or toilets for
Or
that
toilets,
matter.
yes.
A different, which is, by the way, this is the reason why some surveys, I'm not talking about the 2024 elections, as some surveys have shown that women have been increasingly voting for the BJP
That's right.
precisely because of this. There is a separate dimension, which is the participation of women in the labor force. Now, the trouble with doing that is India is still largely an informal economy. So, we don't yet capture the contribution of women in the labor force adequately, just as we do not capture contractual, self employment, informal employment adequately. Having said that, do we do we want a situation where more women should participate in the labor force? The answer is yes. But this is determined by all kinds of different things. There are social norms, so on and so forth.
I also want to come to the point of AI. One of India's big exports was, of course, in services. Now, there have been concerns raised that a lot of those services exports were at a, should I say, mass level, to take a colloquial word. And AI, or the coming of AI and the mass use of AI, might in fact impact those, mass level services exports quite significantly. Do you think that's likely to happen?
Every time a new technology comes in and that technology is perceived to be disruptive, people tend to worry. The what eventually happens is never as bad as those worries suggest. You talked about exports. If I look at India as opposed to just exports, AI is capital intensive, it is technology intensive. My choice of techniques, and there's always a choice, is determined by the price of capital vis-a-vis the price of labor. Labor will always be relatively cheaper in India as compared to, let's say, the US. The simple point I'm making is in India, unlike the US, I should worry less about AI. I should worry more about natural intelligence, or it's not being used, and worry less about artificial intelligence. AI affecting India's services adversely, well, AI is a tool. I could equally well argue that it enables productivity. It enables India's service exports in that particular space to move up the value chain. So I don't know, I'm a bit ambivalent about this.
My last question, the Indian economy, as it propels ahead, will face one serious challenge, and we're already seeing impact of that, which is climate change, which is global warming. Um, that will impact in many, many ways. It'll impact our coastline, for instance. It'll impact our food production. And I have a sort of sub question to this. One of the geostrategic advantages that we have today vis-a-vis China is that China is now increasingly importing more and more of the food that it needs, whereas India is still relatively at a much stronger position of being able to feed its very large population. Now, that's a geostrategic advantage in many people's minds, but climate change will impact that too. I want you to again connect the dots for us on how climate change do you think will impact the progress of the Indian economy, our food production, and could it impact this narrow geostrategic advantage we have in terms of food production vis-a-vis China?
We said earlier, India is a poor country,
Yeah.
relatively. The priorities are improving the lives of the poor. India cannot be burdened with the responsibility of solving global climate problems which have been caused by the developed countries. So, that is not a burden that should be inflicted on us, nor is it a burden that we will accept. Independently, for thousands of years, climate, the protection of the earth has been important to us. In terms of the SDGs on climate change and protecting the environment, we are far ahead compared to many of the developed countries. We have done far more on solar power, we have done far more on net zero, but our priority remains to take care of India's poor. We will therefore deliver power from whichever source it is cheapest to deliver the power, whether it is solar or otherwise. So far as food is concerned, our average productivity levels are still very low. And within India, there are states where the productivity levels are 6 times that in others. You said food, so we are primarily talking about wheat and rice. With some reforms, we can very easily feed double the population. So I would not be worried about that.
My last question then, Vivekta, as you see the Indian economy progress to, third largest economy in the world status, what do you think will be, to sum up, our main advantage? But what is the main thing we should also be worried about?
Well, I think what we should be worried about, not worry is the wrong word to use. The problem is the world's perceptions. The world's perceptions, you mentioned the Japanese earlier, a reluctance on the part of many countries to recognize that India is rising, a reluctance on the part of many countries to recognize that India has to now play a greater role in shaping international financial institutions. which are controlled, not just financial institutions, international institutions, which are controlled by the traditional developed countries, be it the World Bank, be it the IMF, be it the Security Council, be it the WTO. But we are being asked to shoulder the responsibility. To this to me smacks of hypocrisy. So I wouldn't say we would worry about it. I would say that this is something we have to reckon with.
And our biggest advantage.
Our biggest advantage is that we will continue to grow at rates that are extremely, extremely respectable. Our greatest advantage is that after many, many years, Indians are now proud of being Indians, and that does all kinds of things that are impossible to quantify and measure.
Perfect. On that wonderful note, thanks very much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Debroy, for
Thank you.
spending time with us. Thank you.